Thanks very much to all of you for joining us here tonight for the Pacific Council's great debate. My name is Dan Schnurr, and my favorite part of Members Weekend every year is this debate, because unlike everything else we get to experience at Pacific Council, where we get brilliance in a vacuum, the really terrific thing about tonight's program, about the debate, is you get to see four really smart people face off against each other. And the even better thing about it, and for those of you who've been here before, you know what I'm talking about, and for those of you who've not been here in the past, I promise you, you're in for a treat, not just in terms of the substance, because we've got four brilliant panelists here tonight, but I think many of you would agree with me that one of the most frustrating things about public dialogue and public discourse in this era is the lack of civility and the lack of respect and the lack of understanding that when someone disagrees with you, that doesn't mean that they're evil or stupid. It means more likely than not, they're an extremely intelligent person who just happens to have come to a different conclusion about how to best resolve the challenges we face as a community, as a country, and as a world. And of the many, many things that I admire so much about Pacific Council is that when it brings together people like our panel tonight, it's not just an interesting and an important and an informative conversation, but it's a civil one. And even if you walk out of here tonight convinced that two of these people are absolutely, completely, truly, madly, deeply wrong about everything, you're still gonna respect their intellect. And you're gonna be reassured because you know that as we navigate these increasingly treacherous paths in 2017, that there's really smart, principled people on both sides of the debate who can help guide the conversation forward. And for those of you who haven't had the privilege that I have to meet our panelists before tonight's program, I'll tell you, we've got four just tremendous all-stars tonight. And if I were to not only indulge myself, but to give them the respect that they deserve by reading not just their entire biographies, but the highlights of their biographies, it would occupy the entire time allotted, not just for this debate, but for the entire Members Weekend. So what I'm going to ask you to do instead is on your own time, after the debate, read up more and learn more about how impressive our four panelists are. But what I will ask you to do right now simply is to please join me in welcoming, in support of tonight's proposition, which I'll outline for you in just a second, Matthew Spence, the William J. Perry Fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. Matt, thank you so much for being here. My friend John Emerson, not so recently returned from his star turn as United States Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany. John, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
And arguing in just a couple minutes against tonight's proposition, an equally impressive team. Over here at the end of the table is my friend Robert O'Brien. He's the managing partner of Larson O'Brien, LLP. Robert, we're very happy to have you here tonight. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Corey Shockey, who's the Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University as well. Corey, we're very, very happy to have you here as well. So the motion we're going to be considering tonight, as I think all of you know, is as follows. President Barack Obama's foreign policy was a success. And in just a couple of minutes, we're going to hear Matt and John arguing the affirmative, and Robert and Corey arguing against. But I want to take just a minute before we get started with opening remarks from both teams to walk you through the structure for this program. As I think many of you know, we're actually polling you tonight on your answer to that question. Was President Barack Obama's foreign policy a success? And what we're going to ask you to do, for those of you who haven't, between now and in a minute or two when we kick off the opening remarks, we're going to ask those of you who have not yet done so to go to the Pacific Council app on your phones, to find the Members Weekend prompt, and on the activity stream at Members Weekend, you will find the poll that asks the question, was Barack Obama's foreign policy a success? Then what we're going to do after we've heard from both teams And after both teams, in addition to their remarks, have had a chance to answer as many of your questions as possible, is we're going to poll again. And so at the end of the evening, we're going to find out two things. We're going to find out, number one, what the room thinks about the Obama foreign policy. But second, because, and I think more interesting, because my guess is most of you know already what you think, is we're going to see how those numbers changed over the course of the evening. And we're going to see how effectively the two teams did at changing minds in the room. For any political professionals, you know that the most important poll numbers to look at are not the raw numbers, who's ahead and who's behind, but at the trending, at the trajectory, who's making up ground and who's losing ground. So sure, we'll announce the raw numbers at the end of the night, guys, but we want to see how you did as well. So we're going to announce that one before we let you out of here tonight, too.
Dan, can I make a suggestion that everybody vote no on Obama right now?
John Emerson masterfully lowers the bar to start off the evening. Okay. Actually, Robert, I think you'd probably be okay with that, wouldn't you? I thought so. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. In just a moment, we're going to ask the two teams to alternate, offering opening remarks of 3.5 minutes each for each of our four participants. And then we'll do a response round. We'll each have 2.5 minutes to respond to what they heard from the other team in the opening. And then at that point, about 20 minutes or so from now, we'll open it up to audience questions. And for those of you who've attended these programs, either sponsored by the Pacific Council or otherwise before, please know that I will make the familiar request that beleaguered moderators always make when we open a program to questions. I usually ask the audience to remember that, in fact, the questions should come in the form of a question. And what I've learned over my years of working with Pacific Council and its very smart, very well-informed members is that that's sometimes a little bit of a high bar to set. So if you really feel intent on making a statement, that's okay too. Just put a question mark at the end, and we'll pretend. Okay. So we'll get to the questions in just a minute, and then of course we will give both sides a chance to offer concluding statements, and then we'll go back and we'll poll a second time. So with that, we're going to get started, and we're going to start with the affirmative. Those arguing on behalf of the question, was President Barack Obama's foreign policy a success? And so we're going to start over on this side with Matt or John. Which of you would like to kick off? Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Do you want us to come up or do it?
You want to do it from the seat?
Great.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Great. Easy. Well, thank you very much. It's great to have the opportunity to come back home to LA and to have the stage with my friend and former colleague, Ambassador Emerson, and also with friends Corey and Robert on the other side. And also to be joined at this conference by so many former colleagues from the Obama administration who really helped take meaningful steps to make this foreign policy a success. Please stay and vote. And I just want to say, John and I are particularly happy to be arguing this motion right now, rather than trying to defend that a former president's foreign policy was a success either 4 or 8 years from now. Right now, we're glad we're in this position defending President Obama, not President Trump. As Ambassador Emerson and I will argue on the major issues that matter most for keeping America safe, President Obama left our nation much stronger and much safer. But I'd like to begin by taking a step back to frame this discussion. What does it mean for a foreign policy to be a success? Now, the world is a dangerous and messy place, and clearly success does not mean peace on earth, goodwill towards men, and harmony, though being back in LA, I think, is the closest that we'll get to that. But to evaluate this question, we should use two questions that basically are common sense. First, did the president set America on the right path on the big long-term issues that matter most to America in the future? And second, as he dealt with the inevitably difficult foreign policy inbox that any president confronts, did he make any fatal mistakes? Now, to vote in favor of this motion, you do not need to agree with everything that President Obama did. You do not need to agree that he made no mistakes. In fact, or in the words of one of Corey and Robert's Republican colleagues, Robert Kagan, quote, foreign policy is like hitting a baseball. If you fail 70% of the time, you still go to the Hall of Fame. But don't take my word for it. We don't need to run an alternative history to frame what the future would have looked like under another type of foreign policy. We have a real example. And that example is the world that Barack Obama woke up to 8 years ago when he took office in January 2009. And the measure of this foreign policy is not just about how you play the hand that you're dealt, but also how previously bad decisions can make things worse. And I'll be brief just to give an overview before we launch in. First, America and the world faced a major economic crisis. It was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. In the final 4 months of 2008, the United States had lost nearly 2 million jobs. And the fact that the United States cannot be strong abroad if we are weak at home and facing economic crisis. Second, Osama bin Laden was at large with no plan to get to him and was plotting every day to launch attacks against the United States. By the time Barack Obama left office, Osama bin Laden was no longer around, and Al-Qaeda had been decimated with no terrorist attacks plotted successfully against the United States. Third, Iran was about to get a nuclear weapon, and the only way seriously contemplated to stop them was launching war with Iran, which would have been the third major war the United States would have been involved with in the Middle East. Fourth, America was in the middle of 2 major wars in the Middle East without end in sight. In January 2009, there were 180,000 American service members deployed in combat in the Middle East. Not a week or month went by without Americans being wounded or losing their lives, and the total estimated cost of this war was $2.4 trillion, larger than the cost we spend on education, our transportation, or even what universal health care would have cost. And finally, America was fighting these fights largely alone, with alienated allies leaving us alone. Now, before I briefly conclude, I know that Robert and Corey will have much to say about pointing out about the headlines that the world is a dangerous and messy place. Well, of course it is. But as you hear this, I want you to keep 2 things in mind. First, to look at the actual facts, beyond the headlines, what the Obama administration did. And then second, ask, given this very difficult things that presidents face, what are actual alternatives that would have made a difference, that were realistic, that used the right resources, and have produced something different? For this, thank you for the opportunity, and we urge you to vote in favor of the resolution.
We got an extra minute.
And arguing the counters we discussed earlier, Robert O'Brien and Corey Shockey. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here with friends, with Dan and Ambassador Emerson and Professor Spence, but really with Corey. I've worked with Corey for many years in government, and I can't lose with Corey in my corner here. So it's kind of it makes my life easy. So President Obama took office with very high hopes for the future and genuine goodwill from the American people. He promised to transform both America and the world. And it's now very clear in hindsight, after 8 years, he did exactly that. He transformed America and the world. When he left office in January 2017, it was a very dangerous world, and it was a very different world than the one he entered in January 2009 and took over the office from President Bush. In his inaugural address, you'll recall that President Obama said to our adversaries that we will extend our hand if you are willing to unclench your fist. He then went to the NATO summit in April and redefined American exceptionalism. He said, I believe in American exceptionalism just as I suspect the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. He told the Europeans that there are times that America has shown arrogance and has been dismissive and derisive. He went to Turkey and said the United States is still working through some of our own darker periods in our history. He did the same thing in Cairo when he talked about fear and anger from 9/11 leading us to act in ways that betrayed our values. President Obama boasted in 2012, after 4 years in office, that he personally guided the process by which the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard had become the smallest since World War II. Using the Budget Control Act or defense sequestration, he literally chopped $1 trillion from the Gates baseline budget from our military. He said he would use that money to pay down the debt and rebuild America. Neither happened. I think that he honestly believed that if he engaged in unilateral disarmament, our adversaries would do the same. By minimizing our role as a historic and exceptional nation, by distancing himself from our allies, and by weakening our defenses, I think he believed that the autocrats, the tyrants, the terrorists would indeed take his unclenched fist and become his partners. Unfortunately, they didn't. Strategic patience or leading from behind, and those are both words, those weren't made up by Republicans, those are how the Obama administration described their foreign policy, very different from a peace through strength posture that what we were familiar with President Reagan, led to a series of events. We watched in March 2014 as the Russians invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. They did that in response to the further drawdown of American forces and armor in Europe. China saw the U.S. Navy stretch to the breaking point, and we've now sadly seen, with the lives of 17 young sailors who've been killed on the McCain and Fitzgerald, that the Navy is broken, especially in the Western Pacific. China saw that, and they basically annexed the South China Sea. They were able to do that because the Obama administration, not wanting to offend Beijing, would not engage in freedom of navigation patrols. Iran learned that there was no behavior or no demand that they could make that would stop America from appeasing it with the JCPOA. And they began cementing their hegemony over the Middle East, from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea. Bashir al-Assad crossed the chemical weapons red line without penalty, and with Russian and Iranian assistance has destroyed Syria. We withdrew from Iraq against the best advice of our generals, and ISIS created a caliphate the size of Great Britain, which is only now being dismantled. And finally, as we know, Kim Jong-un has busied himself building at least 60 nuclear weapons and the ICBMs to threaten CONUS. So there's really, under any objective measure, there's no way to argue, and my friends argue in good faith, but there's no way to objectively argue that President Barack Obama's foreign policy can be deemed in any way a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert O'Brien. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dan and Corey and Robert. It's great to be here with you, and of course, my good friend and former colleague, Matt Spence. And as always, it's great to be back at Pacific Council. You know, it's interesting in listening to Robert, and there's a lot we can respond to there. We'll save that for the response session. But the truth is, Barack Obama was dealt a fairly challenging hand, as Matt outlined, when he came into office. But he not only played that hand well, but he also took some seriously concrete steps to strengthen our national security interests around the world. And let me just go through a few of them. Number one, and Matt mentioned this, and I think we need to underscore it, the fact that we've had a period of unprecedented prosperity in the United States, the fact that Obama's policies, in effect, helped us avoid what could have been a worldwide depression, is something that we cannot ignore. As John Kerry often said, economic policy is foreign policy. And in point of fact, when the economy is doing well, when people are feeling more secure, it actually does make us more secure. Secondly, Robert was right in what he said about the president's initial inaugural address and some of those early speeches. And one of the foreign policy successes was the fact that Barack Obama was able to rebuild our alliances and re-engage in multilateral relationships that had, in many instances, gone fallow. Here are some examples. Number one, instead of a coalition of the willing going into Iraq, we have a real coalition of 73 nations, as we heard from General Brown this morning, to defeat and degrade ISIL. And in fact, the work that was started long ago in the Obama administration with no change in plans is continuing through, hopefully, to a soon victory in that regard. Secondly, President Obama was able to work with Russia, with China, with our allies in Europe, the P5+1, to not only impose back-breaking sanctions on Iran, but then to work to develop and reach an agreement with the JCPOA, which is, I think, as we look at the situation in North Korea today, that agreement's starting to look better and better every day. Number three, in the Ukraine situation, Russia did not annex Crimea and intervene in the Donbass because they thought Obama was weak. I don't think Russia expected the United States would respond militarily. They did so because they felt that was an existential threat. What was happening on the Maidan, what happened when Yanukovych departed, an existential threat to them. And in point of fact, we worked very closely, and I was involved in this with Chancellor Merkel to not only impose sanctions to the United States, but to have the EU impose equally strong sanctions and renew them again and again every 6 months. Think about our trade relationships, the Korea Free Trade Deal, TPP, which sadly the Trump administration has walked away from, but had huge bipartisan support, support from many Republicans for their value. He worked to strengthen NATO with the framework nation concept and to begin nations moving to that 2%. And as we heard again this morning, the importance of the rebalance in Asia, where today, according to General Brown, our relationship with Korea and Japan has never been stronger. And let's not forget about COP21, where Barack Obama working with Xi, got the Chinese for the first time to agree to to agree to standards that they would hit with regard to carbon emissions, all at the same time moving America to a point of oil independence. And then finally, we've got to think about disasters that did not happen, like the Ebola crisis, which because of American leadership, we were able to avert. And then truly, finally, I think Barack Obama, the dignity, the way he handled himself, the fact there was no scandal in this administration, first time with a two-term president in my lifetime that has happened. I think what he did was really restore America's voice as a moral authority in the world, and that is also quite an accomplishment. Thank you.
And arguing against the proposition, Corey.
So I think my friend Matt Spence set the right standard for I think my friend Matt Spence set the right standard by saying that the way to judge President Obama's foreign policy is by what the alternatives are, right? And so I'd like to talk through what the world might have looked like if we had 8 years of a different foreign policy than President Obama's foreign policy. First, if the president had not drawn a red line in Syria and then failed to enforce that red line in Syria, we might not have had 11 million Syrian refugees, people whose lives have now been disfigured by the brutality of that government and our failure to mobilize the international community to prevent it. Moreover, Europe would be a different place without more than 1 million refugees who are never going home to Syria now because Bashar al-Assad will remain in power. In Iraq, the hard work of winning the war in Iraq had been done before 2008. And having not rushed to the exits, having not averted our eyes from the stealing of the 2008 parliamentary elections, the violation of the Constitution about who got to form a government, the striking of judges off of the commission, democracy in Iraq might have progressed far enough that ISIS, the stepson of Al-Qaeda, which was, excuse me, Matt, not extinguished in President Obama's term, would not have gotten such a ferocious foothold in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, permutating around the world. The so-called pivot to Asia. I think it's a wonderful idea. In fact, when I was Director for Defense Strategy in the Bush administration, we set it in motion by moving American forces to the Pacific. Moreover, we negotiated the Korean Free Trade Agreement that got affirmed in the Obama administration. If President Obama had more assiduously supported trade policy, instead of having run against NAFTA in 2008. We might have had a Trans-Pacific trade agreement that could have been marshaled through Congress in his presidency. Moreover, we might have capitalized on the biggest missed opportunity we as a strong power with great neighbors have, which is the consolidation of North America as a platform of democracy, as a platform for energy, as a platform for peace and security. Moreover, we might have won the Afghan war rather than treading water for 8 years and having it still having to be fought through. And lastly, I think, we would not have North Korea on the brink of nuclear weapons with long-range missiles that could attack this beautiful city if President Obama had not averted his eyes from that problem for 8 years.
Thank you, Cory. So having concluded our first round of opening statements, we're going to move on now to the response round. And we're going to ask each of our 4 panelists to engage for a slightly shorter time in response to what they heard from the opening statements from their opposite numbers. We're going to start with the affirmative once again, with Robert and John. Each of our 4 participants will have 2.5 minutes to offer response and rebuttal to the opening round of statements.
Thank
Matt?
you. I want to respond to the 5 things that Cory and Robert outlined. And again, what they've gone is gone through what the headlines have been and why the world has been a dangerous place, but in no way has shown how any different actions would have produced something different. And let me tell you why. First, in Syria, Cory argues that if Barack Obama had launched military strikes to get chemical weapons, there would not be the Syrian refugee crisis. That's wrong on several fronts. The refugee crisis began before that and was unfortunately the function of Bashar Assad doing terrible things to his people. But the reality is that there was no meaningful alternative to Assad, and we saw what happens when we try to bring down a dictator without a plan of what can happen next, and that tragedy, unfortunately, was the war in Iraq. A war in Iraq which cost an enormous amount of our treasure, an enormous amount of our lives lost. And our military planners themselves at the time said that if military strikes were taken against the chemical weapons, they were so dispersed, they could have been plumes of chemical weapons throughout the region, and it was very unclear we could get all of them. Instead, by threatening the use of force, Assad gave up his chemical weapons and had not used them again. So what was meant to happen actually did. Second, on Iraq. With Iraq, the idea that if the United States had kept a few thousand troops in Iraq, that ISIS would have been avoided is simply not borne out by history. In fact, the origins of ISIS, for those who look at the region know, came from dismantling Saddam Hussein's army, which happened during the poorly thought out war against Iraq that George W. Bush began. With that strategic mistake that put us into a war with no end in sight, the alternative was to have hundreds of thousands of American troops stranded in the deserts without a sense of what we would do next. Instead, the United States and Barack Obama fought a war against ISIS that cost $10 billion total instead of $10 billion a month. Third, on the pivot to Asia. China was delighted that the United States was spending its resources tied down in the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan. When George Bush left office, the United States was absent largely from the major Asian security forums, and it was, in fact, Barack Obama who signed the Korean Free Trade Agreement, that began TPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, and it was not a Democrat, but a Republican who one of his first acts pulled out of that and took us out of Asia under what President Trump did. On the major issues what we did. And then finally on North Korea had been an enormous amount of problems for many previous presidents. They tested their first nuclear weapon under a president who's not Barack Obama, and they launched their first ballistic missile under President Trump. It has been a constant problem that we've looked at to try to stop that from happening, but that has been nothing new to President Obama and continued before and afterwards.
Thank you, Matt. The response from the no side. Robert.
Thank you, and thank you, Matt. What's interesting when you hear President Obama's supporters, and I'm sympathetic to him because it's a very difficult, if you're a debater, it's a very difficult case to make, but they tend to have 2 big arguments, and they were the same arguments that were made over 8 years. First is blame George Bush, right? George W. Bush caused all this, and President Obama's going to fix it. He didn't fix any of it, and it may have worked in year 1. You know, it was getting pretty tiresome in year 8. Number two was this classic straw man argument that President Obama, he was a great straw man. He could out-debate any straw man. And the straw man always was, it's either the neocons in war or it's my way of appeasing our adversaries. And again, there's a long way between appeasement and war, and we didn't use our national power in any of these instances, whether it was Iraq or Syria or the Ukraine, the list goes on and on. With respect to the pivot to Asia, there couldn't be an effective pivot to Asia because the Navy was broken. The reason it was broken is because we denied our sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines the funds they needed not only to protect our country and our allies, but to protect themselves. And we've now seen the results of that. With respect to the TPP, President Obama was not able to get the TPP ratified. He's now blamed it. It was something he could not get done during his administration. He's now attempting, or his supporters are blaming President Trump for that. Keep in mind, Hillary Clinton, his chosen successor, his Secretary of State, also said that she would reject TPP. But one of the fundamental problems we have, and I take issue with my good friend Ambassador Emerson on this, is this idea that we somehow engaged our allies during the Obama administration. In fact, it was one of the most shameful exercises of the Obama administration. Take, for example, the United Kingdom. President Obama went to Cartagena, Colombia, and in a speech attempted to refer to the Falkland Islands as the Malvinas. He actually called them the Maldives, which are a different set of islands in the Indian Ocean. He did not get hammered by the press for that. You can imagine what they would have done to poor George W. Bush or President Trump had he made the same mistake. But he does this at a time that the Royal Marines are fighting and dying in Helmand Province to help us in Afghanistan, ultimately as a result of the attacks of 9/11. That's not a way to treat an ally. That's not rebuilding bilateral relationships. That's what Niall Gardner said is stabbing the United Kingdom in the back. The situation with Bibi Netanyahu in Israel doesn't need any recounting, but to hold him waiting for an hour for a meeting with the President of the United States is embarrassing. But it just doesn't stop there. The Czech Republic and Poland agreed to put in, at great risk, anti-ballistic missile defenses in their territory. They're on the front lines against the Russians. The first thing the president did was pull those out and give them to Russia without any consultation with our Eastern European allies in an effort to, quote, reset the relationship with Russia. Obviously, that didn't work out well. You can add Taiwan and others to the mix of allies that were very poorly treated during the Obama administration. So again, that was a strategic mistake, and it was all part of an effort to show our adversaries that we'll put our friends to the side and reach our hand out to you. Please be our friend. We saw what that reaped, and what it reaped was a very dangerous world, and that's why we have the headlines that Professor Spence has talked about. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much. Back to the affirmative. John Emerson.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you what, I don't think that the Russians thought Barack Obama was too soft on them, or they wouldn't have spent so much time and energy and treasure interfering in our presidential election to make sure that his hand-chosen successor didn't become president of the United States, or at a minimum, and I think this probably was the motivation, undermine or create a dynamic that would undermine her presidency. And I don't think the folks in ISIL, after that 73 nation coalition to defeat and degrade ISIL, thought he was exactly extending his hand to them, or the people who were killed. And I heard about this all the time in Germany from folks on the left who were upset about the drone attacks, but were regularly taken out. And I don't think Osama bin Laden thought he was being too nice to him either. And in terms of the Iran agreement, this was not Barack Obama and John Kerry clearly took the leadership role in negotiating that agreement. The alternative was war. They were literally at the point of about to be at the place where North Korea is today. So the alternative was war. And you had not just President Obama, but you had President Xi and Putin and Merkel and Cameron and Hollande all working through this and developing it. And you'd have to just believe, if this agreement was so awful as portrayed, that all these people took giant stupid pills at the same time, because it's in none of their nation's interest either that this not be effective. On the red line, situation, I was in Germany when that came about, and initially, when he made the red line comment, people were looking at me like I had horns growing out of my head. You guys can't seriously be thinking about getting into a third war in the Middle East. But we were fully moving forward and preparing to do that. And again, thanks to diplomacy, and the Germans were actually fairly intimately involved in this, we were able to destroy that cache of chemical weapons without having to fire a shot. That is actually not a bad result. And again, having lived in the refugee crisis and probably spent as much time dealing with that as anybody in this room, the idea of suggesting that because we didn't send over, 56 cruise missiles to punish Saddam Hussein the way Donald Trump did after he used chemical weapons again, that's why we had this flow of refugees, really ignores history and ignores the timetable and ignores the facts. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And finally, arguing against our proposition, Dr. Corey Chavez.
I'm so glad that John raised the issue of Russia, because that's where I want to close the conversation. It does seem to me, my friend, that there are alternative explanations about why the Russians intervened in America's elections. And one of them might be that they were not afraid of the United States defending our own sovereignty, defending the integrity of our processes. I don't begrudge President Obama. I don't agree with my good friend Robert that we should begrudge President Obama trying to reset relations with the Russians at the start of his administration. I think that's smart policy. I think every American president ought to see if they can turn keys in the lock, find a new way to do stuff, pick up opportunities where they might be. Where I do think President Obama's foreign policy deserves a fair amount of criticism is in persevering in that policy long after it ought to have been evident that it was not producing the returns that he had hoped for. And it seems to me that was clearly obvious by 2012 when, as you will recall, during the presidential debates, Governor Romney listed Russia as the #1 geopolitical threat to the United States, and President Obama derisively said the 1980s have called and they want their foreign policy back. I myself believe that Russia is more a threat to us through its weakness than its strength, but it is a threat to us, and President Obama did too little in pushing back on bad Russian behavior, in reassuring America's friends and allies that we would stand with them in confronting the Russians on it. And, for example, in Syria, not leaving the space for the Russians to become the arbiter of the outcome of the Syrian civil war and Iranian behavior in the Middle East. I think there are lots of areas of U.S.-Russian relations that President Obama declined to take as assertive a role as he ought to have, and that may in fact be his biggest foreign policy mistake.
Thank you, Corey Shockey. Let's, before we open this conversation to questions from as many of you as possible, let's take a moment to thank all 4 of our guest experts for a fascinating, a civil, a respectful, if yet occasionally testy conversation. In that spirit, I will apologize in advance to all of those of you in the room tonight who do have questions that you'd like to raise. By my own count, the flashpoints we have thus far covered tonight are Syria, Iraq, Iran, Asia, North Korea, trade, Russia, as well as the broader question of U.S. relationships with our allies and our place in the world. We have 16 minutes with which to get through questions on those 7 topics and any others you may have, so we're probably not going to get to all of them, except my apologies in advance for that. Alex, do we have microphones for the audience? Okay, so if you will raise your hand, we will get a microphone to you as quickly as possible. And once again, I'd ask the question be as brief as possible in order to give our experts as much time as they deserve in order to address your question in the depth that you deserve. Yes, yes, sir, right here.
Lucky me. So Ben suggested that we should measure President Obama's success in foreign policy by fatal mistakes he did not make. I'm not sure if it was a fatal mistake, but I'd like to suggest to you that maybe the most serious mistake I saw our country make over the last 8 years was in its mishandling of cybersecurity. And I believe that that may indeed turn out to have been a fatal mistake. But I also don't want to blame President Obama particularly for that, because it might have been easy for any president to have made that mistake. But we just did not put enough focus, enough resources on this early enough. And it actually is a foreign policy issue because this is a global issue. I'd like to hear what each side thinks about that.
What we'll ask, because we have so many topics we'd like to cover, is to ask one representative from each side weigh in for roughly 1 minute, because obviously that's more than enough time to address the issue of cybersecurity in the 21st century.
In my 1 minute on cybersecurity, now that I've lost 20 seconds saying this, I would push back and say cybersecurity is enormously hard, but there are 3 very concrete things that President Obama did to put it on the front page. First, beginning from 2009, probably his 3rd act in office was to order a comprehensive review of American cybersecurity policy. I was in the Situation Room at one of those times. I saw the amount of time it took, and that was one of the first priorities. Second, in using cybersecurity to make America strong, if you believe what you read in the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Obama administration used cybersecurity very effectively to set back the Iranian and the North Korean missile programs and nuclear programs in a way that allowed goals to be accomplished without putting American troops in harm's way in combat. And third, when you look at what cybersecurity is being done to steal American trade secrets, which are core to our economic growth, the Obama administration included a very difficult agreement with China, which no one thought was possible. And our tech companies report that since that agreement was concluded, the Chinese interference in industrial espionage using cyber methods has stopped and has been something else. So it is enormously hard. You can fight a war on poverty and a war on cancer and never expect to cure it. Cyber is of that nature, but of specific things to address what matters most to keeping Americans strong, President Obama did what was right on cybersecurity.
Matt, thanks very much. Robert, Corey, would you like to weigh in?
I'll weigh in very briefly. And look, the failure of the United States to protect its critical infrastructure and its critical assets from cyber attacks, especially in cyber espionage, especially PRC-sponsored cyber espionage, is perhaps the greatest failing of the West since we allowed Germany to rearm in the 20s and 30s. It's that serious. The Chinese are producing about a ship a week, it seems like, a submarine a month. They have stealth. Their latest destroyer looks very much like the Arleigh Burke. It has an Aegis-type radar. They didn't have to spend any of the research and development money to acquire that technology. They simply traipsed in to U.S. government systems and private contractors and took them. Their J-20 new stealth fighter looks like a cross between the F-22 and the F-35. In fact, we learned even last week that they'd broken into an Australian defense contractor and stolen plans for the F-35, which is our cutting-edge, brand new fighter bomber that we've spent billions and billions of dollars on. There's been no retaliation by the administration, by the Obama administration, for this continued cyber espionage that has allowed our adversaries to catch up with us and may allow them to possibly surpass us with respect to military hardware, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, not to mention the economic espionage that's taken place and harmed American companies. A very serious matter, and it's something that was given very short shrift during the Obama administration, unfortunately. Again, it was kind of this idea, we don't want to embarrass President Xi, we want to unclench our fist and reach out to the Chinese, and maybe if we turn the other way, we turn a blind eye to this theft and this espionage, it will get better for us. In fact, it's gotten worse for us, and the world has become more dangerous because of that naivete.
And just a
Dan,
reminder that next year's proposition will be, was the Mark Zuckerberg foreign policy agenda a success?
Dan, could we respond to each other for those things?
You
Or
know what I'd like to do, if we can, is to make sure we cover as broad a range of
All right.
questions as possible. Yes, right here, young man.
One area that President Obama broke with decades of foreign policy on that we haven't really talked about right now is Cuba. Do you think that was a
Right.
good thing or a bad thing?
And let's start with those arguing against today's proposition, and then come back.
But
to
should
you.
they go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We want them to go first all the time. We'll respond.
Good team bats last, so be careful.
I think President Obama was right to make a move to open up Cuba, not least because we ought not to be in the work of doing repressive government's job for them. So if the Cuban government wants to keep the Cuban people away from the influence of vibrancy and freedom and prosperity, that ought to be the Cuban government's job. But the way he did it, I think, made it much harder to sustain the success. And also, he ought perhaps to have gotten some protections for Cuban political dissidents, some compromises from the Cuban government for lifting the sanctions against them. I think he missed a lot of opportunities to make a better deal for the people of Cuba.
I'm going to yield my time to my colleague who has more to say than just Cuba.
I think on Cuba, I agree with Corey that it was an important thing that President Obama did, and actually having the courage to take that as an affirmative agenda is a big thing. I would just say the fact that President Obama was able to do things like negotiate a climate agreement that no one thought was possible, open diplomatic relations with Cuba in a way that helped the Cuban people, as Corey talked about, those are things that are possible when you're not distracted by other things in foreign policy. And the reality is, when you're fighting major wars in the Middle East and spending that time there, that is where the oxygen and the situation room and the resources go. And President Obama was able to do the types of things that really matter and yield concrete dividends. I just wanted to say one thing just on the cyber piece, with Robert said a lot, is I would say two things on the cyber, which is incredibly important. Thankfully, there has not been a major attack on America's critical infrastructure by cyber, and I think that is in part due to the enormous work with state and local law enforcement and what the Obama administration tried to do. But where there has been a major cyber attack on the United States, an attack on America's election system by the Russian government, that is one thing that the Obama administration did sanction the Russians, and the Trump administration has done nothing to punish or try to deter the Russians from future cyber attacks. So as we're evaluating the nature of cyber attacks and what can be done, look at what the actual plans have been for responding to deterring what happened. If you compare what President Obama did to President Trump, they could not have been more different on this critical issue.
Thank you, Matt. Let's go on to our next question. We have one over here from the young woman at this table, second from the front.
Thank you. As an Afghan American, I'm interested in hearing both sides touch on Obama's drone policy.
Sorry, Obama's,
Drone policy.
the question is on Obama's drone policy. John, Matt?
Well, this was something that obviously, as I mentioned earlier, came up a great deal in Germany. And the fact of the matter is, he took several things about it. Number one, the command and control aspect of drones was the people who were actually flying the drones, and we call them remotely piloted vehicles because that's in fact what they are. They are piloted. There was they had to go way higher up to the food chain, including into the White House, before being given the authority to launch an attack. Number one. Number two. There were enormous steps that were taken to avoid the tragedy of civilian deaths accompanying a drone strike. Unfortunately, that obviously isn't perfect, but there's been a huge, you can see the success of at least what the Obama administration was trying to do when you compare the number of civilian deaths that have occurred since the Trump administration came in terms of these drone strikes. And number three, what's your alternative? I mean, if you want to degrade and destroy an organization like ISIL, an organization like Al-Qaeda, which I think was pretty well, consensus from the standpoint of both parties, you use the remotely piloted vehicles and those kinds of smart bomb attacks versus sending thousands of troops on the ground and all the logistical support and civilian support that's needed to back up that kind of operation. I mean, I hate to use this kind of word when you're talking about lives of people, but it's a much more well, efficient's the word I don't want to use, so I won't. It's much more effective in terms of accomplishing your goals and minimizing the awful collateral damage that can happen.
Don, thank you very much. Corey Shockey.
So President Obama's drone policy was an expansion in kind of Bush administration policy, right? As I think you just heard from John, there's an enormous temptation by political leaders to think, but we can kill bad guys and we can put so few people at risk. And they did not wrestle in a serious way with two important elements of that approach to the policy. The first is, what happens when we're not the only people who have this ability? They missed an enormous opportunity to create an international agreement, surprising given how much President Obama philosophically is drawn in that direction, to create norms and legalities for use of drones. And the second thing that they never seem to wrestle seriously with are the foreign policy implications of what that policy feels like to the people in whose countries we are operating them. My own view is that we ought to make a distinction between persistent surveillance, which is the great advantage that drones give us, and much greater restraint about their use for violence. Because the foreign policy consequences for average Pakistanis and for Yemenis and others has never been weighed into the equation and is extraordinarily damaging to what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Corey Shockey. Let's stay over on this side of the room. This gentleman has a question at the front table. We'll get you a microphone in just 1 second, sir.
I have a question for Corey. The Pentagon estimated that it would cost about 70,000 troops to take out the chemical weapons in Syria. And the reason they wanted to use, if that was going to be done, conventional forces is because air forces alone, we didn't have sufficient intelligence to determine where the sites of the chemical weapons were. So would you be disposed, or were you disposed to allocating 70,000 troops, an additional involvement in the Middle East at the time we were contemplating this, where the Obama administration eliminated much of the arsenal by threatening to bombard the Syrian forces, and the Russians and the U.S. Were ultimately able to eliminate most of the serious chemical weapons in Syria?
You know, it's an interesting and a really important question, but my experience as a defense planner has been that there's not just one way to do things, there are lots of ways to do things. And for example, one needn't destroy all of Syria's chemical weapons to prevent the government from using them against their own civilians, as the Trump administration's deterrent strike against Syria's remaining chemical weapons, which they continued to use into 2017, demonstrates. There are lots of different ways to do things, and I think one of the fallacies very often advocated by President Obama and his administration was that, you know, we don't want to send 100,000 troops to do this as though that were the only way to manage a problem, when in fact there are a lot of turns of the kaleidoscope. The point of warfare is actually affecting your adversary's calculus, not necessarily completely disarming them.
Sir, Corey's a good friend, and I agree with her that there are lots of different ways to do things. And one of those ways to do things is, rather than go to war to solve a problem, to threaten the use of force, scare the bejesus out of your enemies, being Syria and Russia, and get them to give up their chemical weapons, which we would not have done if we had not threatened to do something very bad for them. And there are many ways you can do things, but what you can't do is say 100,000 US troops or $2.3 trillion is not the way to do it, but there is some other secret plan that would be better to magically solve these problems without articulating actually what that other solution is. These are incredibly hard problems, and I'll admit, we settle often on imperfect solutions, but when you look at what actually was gotten done, and in this case, making sure chemical weapons are not on the battlefield, and if they were used again, only then use chemical weapons, this was a creative approach that President Obama used that minimized risks to American lives, that may not have looked pretty at times, but got what was needed to be done to protect American interests, minimizing risk to American lives.
Let the record show that Matt has begun all of his responses by saying either I agree with Corey or I agree with Robert before disagreeing with Corey or Robert. That is the essence of civility. Thank you very much, Matt.
I agree with parts.
Let's go over to this side of the room for a question. To this gentleman in the first table.
My question is this. Would you agree that whether the Obama administration contributed to greater mutual respect and understanding among people of different ethnicities, immigration status, religious backgrounds, and attitudes on social issues was an aspect that influences in a major way national security? And if you do agree that that's an important aspect of national security, would you regard the Obama administration's record on that aspect as more successful than the Trump approach is likely to be?
The answer is yes and yes. Actually, that was a point I was trying to get to when I was sort of breathlessly going through the points at the beginning in my opening comments when I talked about, in part, just restoring moral authority and also restoring a sense of respect and admiration for the United States around the world. And I think it has enormous national security consequences. And I think that, and you can see this immediately. I'm obviously very close, just to take my one little piece of the world, the Federal Republic of Germany, but you could see it immediately in the reaction that folks in Germany had, not only to the election of Donald Trump and concerns about the rhetoric in the campaign, but also then to, of course, one of his first actions, which was the ban. And that there's just no question to me that that those kinds of actions actually undermine our national security objectives, and in point of fact, certainly lead to a loss of respect for the United States abroad.
Robert.
So let me respond to that. I think it was a very proud moment for all of our, in all of our lives, to see Barack Obama sworn in as President of the United States. To elect an African American as President of the United States, given our history, that was a big step for our country. And that's why I think that President Obama came into office with genuine goodwill from the vast majority of Americans, including people that did not vote for him. And I do agree with Matt that he conducted himself and his family conducted themselves with dignity while in office. And that's something that, again, we can be proud of as Americans. The concern is, it's not that Barack Obama is not a good person and that he didn't do good things and he wasn't a trailblazer. He was all those things. It's that his policies were a disaster. And so just to focus on this issue, I mean, this isn't a comparison of Donald Trump and Barack Obama. That's not the debate we're having. We're having a retrospective debate on President Obama's foreign policy. So when we ask about relations or how things are going in the United States, President Obama, without congressional authorization, in an unconstitutional manner, as the Supreme Court found, and without the support of the American people, enacted basically an open borders policy in the United States. He basically opened our southern borders to anyone who would like to come here. That may be a good policy. I don't agree with it. That may be a good policy, but that was something he did unilaterally and without proper authority. Another example, when we talk about this rubric of tolerance, we've been fighting a war since 9/11, but it goes back much farther than 9/11. I mean, think about the first World Trade Center bombing. Think about Khobar Towers. Think about all of the attacks on Americans as a result of Islamic extremism. Both sides of the coin. The Islamic extremism that has been funded by the Islamic Republic of Iran and the mullahs, who since their first day in office have captured, kidnapped, and maltreated our diplomats and killed hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers and airmen through the course of their regime. And the flip side of that coin, ISIS, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and the Sunni extremists. Because of political correctness and this idea of tolerance, we were not able for 8 years to actually identify our adversaries. How often did you hear Iran referred to as the Islamic Republic or the Islamic State referred to as the Islamic State? We couldn't actually identify our adversaries. And when I was in the Middle East on various occasions, I was shocked by Gulf Arabs and Israelis and our friends there saying, why won't the president identify the jihadis that we're fighting against? And so President Obama was a trailblazer, and it was a wonderful moment for America when he was elected. But some of the policies under this rubric of tolerance were very detrimental to the United States, our allies, and our interests.
Thank you, Robert. Unfortunately, we have time for only one more question, and I'm going to take moderator's prerogative on this one. As some of you may know, that since I joined you last year, although I continue to teach at the University of Southern California, I've stepped down from my full-time position there. I started a few months ago as the executive director for the American Jewish Committee for the Los Angeles region. So with that moderator's prerogative, I will start out first on this side and then go to the other to ask one final question. The United States-Israel relationship, please.
Well, look, Corey's better qualified to answer this question than I will, but we actually spent time together back in 2012 in Israel. We were there for about a week, traveling the length and the breadth of the country. Israel is one of the miracles of the 20th century. When we talk about being proud of things that the United States was involved in as a country, President Truman reaching out and recognizing the Jewish state, recognizing Israel in 1948 is one of the great things that we can be proud of as Americans, and to have seen the desert bloom. And I remember when I first went to Israel in '87, it was very much second world, it's probably not politically correct anymore, agriculturally based state. To go to Israel now and see the gleaming towers and the high tech and this vibrant democracy, the only place in the Middle East where Christians, Arab Christians and Arab Muslims and Israeli Jews, secular and Orthodox and conservative, that everyone's allowed to participate in the democracy. It's really an amazing place. Unfortunately, Israel was treated very poorly under the Obama administration. I don't need to go into the details. I think that this administration is very committed, the current administration is very committed to a strong Israeli-American relationship. That strong Israeli-American relationship is good not just for Israel, but it's good for us. And to support and to be best friends again and not treat our good friend, our democratic ally, our most important ally in the Middle East shabbily, which is how they were treated under the Obama administration, but to treat them again as a valued partner and a friend and a country that we want to support through thick and thin. I think that's one of the benefits of the changes in administration, and for those of us that are on both sides of the aisle that are friends with our friends in Israel, I'm looking forward to a continued long and a very positive relationship with both the government of Israel and also the people of Israel.
Thank you, Robert. John or Matt?
So I think this is an incredibly important question about U.S. support for the strength of Israel. And I agree that Israel is a miracle, and Israel is deserving of the strong support the United States can give. And I imagine those of you in this room who might have come into this room thinking that President Obama's foreign policy was not a success might have Israel at the top of your mind. And you might remember stories of this thing, which I don't think is true, that President Obama kept the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, waiting in an hour for a meeting. And you'll hear disagreements personally between Barack Obama and Bibi Netanyahu. But here's the facts of what President Obama did for the state of Israel. And I speak very personally about this because when I was heading up Middle East policy at the Defense Department, I went to Israel 30 times in 3.5 years. And we spent more time in intimate defense and military conversations with the Israelis than anywhere else on the planet. And here's actually what President Obama did. President Obama provided more military assistance to the state of Israel than any other president in American history. And a year before he left office, he signed a memorandum of understanding to provide over $32 billion in American military assistance over 10 years. President Obama came up with a plan called the Iron Dome Missile Defense System, which knocks down 80 to 90% of rockets and missiles that can fly on vulnerable Israel cities. That is a type of technology initiated by President Obama, which was implemented and saves Israeli lives every day. That the number of military exercises between the United States and Israel is at its all-time height. But you don't need to listen to me. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of the Israelis. It was Ehud Barak, no shrinking violet, the former defense minister of Israel, who said that the defense and security relationship between the United States and Israel had never been stronger than Barack Obama was president. It is an important issue, and I would say, ending this, at a time when the Middle East, due to a lot of factors, is as most unstable it's often been, due to longer-term trends in the Middle East, there are not rockets firing down on Israel every day. And despite what's happening around Israel's border, due to the strong defense and military cooperation, the Israelis remain safe, and that was a key priority of President Obama to keep it that way and strengthen it.
Thank you, Matt. We will reconvene this panel on this question at the AJC Hanukkah party this year. When all of you have a chance to return to here. We're now going to move to the last portion of our program before voting. And just a reminder, once our panelists have concluded their closing statements, we're going to ask you to go back to the Pacific Council app one more time and cast your vote either the same way or different than you did at the beginning of this program. So we'll conclude the program by once again starting with the affirmative. Matt or John, which one of you would like to begin?
How much time do we have for this?
2.5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I would just summarize by reminding you all of what kind of world Barack Obama inherited. And this isn't about blaming Bush, by the way. I mean, you can go back and blame the lines that were drawn in the Middle East after the end of, the First World War, if you want to go back that far. It's not about blaming Bush at all. It's just a reality of the complexity and the dangers, particularly from an economic standpoint, of the world that he inherited. Look at how he was able to get the entire globe focused on this whole issue of climate change, to the point where every single nation in the world, with the exception of Nicaragua, who didn't sign it because they didn't think it was strong enough, and Syria, participated in and committed themselves to reductions through COP21 and the Paris Accords. Look at how he did rebuild, and Robert pointed out this guy was insulted and he mispronounced this name and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, it is indisputable that Barack Obama rebuilt and strengthened our alliances around the world. And to the extent they didn't exist, created multilateral engagements that ended up being critical for our national security objectives on everything from trade to the Iran nuclear deal to punishing Russia for what it did in the Ukraine, and on and on and on. Think about the disasters that did not occur. We did not have a massive terrorist strike. We had some terrible homegrown terrorist strikes in the United States, but we did not have the kind of thing that we've seen over and over again in Europe, for instance, over the past few years in the United States. And again, looking forward, being forward-thinking about pandemics and the speed with which he was able to pull together some of our allies and get in there and help rebuild the public health infrastructure of West Africa and get on top of and contain and ultimately bottle up the Ebola crisis is a significant, significant accomplishment. And then finally, I would say that, again, at the time he came in, we weren't exactly admired in most corners of the world. And at the time he left, there was incredible admiration, which allows you as a country to do more and to accomplish more. And I'm sad to say that seems to be something that has been squandered in recent months. And I know that it's not a debate about Obama versus Trump, and it's also not a debate about Obama versus Bush, but you need to, as Matt said at the beginning, you need to compare it to something. You know, you can't just look at a foreign policy and compare it to a perfect world. And I think when you do that, there is no question that you would feel good and right about voting for this resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Emerson. Robert O'Brien.
Thanks. When Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea back in March of 2014, it immediately caused me to remember Christmas Eve, 1979. And you recall on that date, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was the first time that Soviet troops had been used outside the Eastern Bloc since World War II. It was a watershed event for the world and for the country. And much like the Obama administration was in 2014, the Carter administration was already reeling from a series of foreign policy failures. John Lewis Gaddis wrote, the invasion was only the most dramatic in a series of humiliations for the United States during the Carter years. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan shocked Jimmy Carter into changing course. 6 days after the invasion, Carter admitted that in his opinion of the Russians had changed more drastically in the last week than even the previous 2.5 years before it. Addressing Congress, he said it was the most serious threat to peace since the Second World War. So what did Carter do? He authorized increased lethal military support for the Mujahideen. He withdrew from SALT II, withdrew SALT II from Senate consideration. He canceled grain exports to the Soviet Union. He boycotted the Olympics. He articulated the Carter Doctrine in the Persian Gulf. And he started increasing defense spending. He actually got the Reagan defense buildup going. During his presidency, many Republicans called President Obama the worst foreign policy president since Jimmy Carter. But it's now become clear that that comparison was entirely unfair. And it was unfair to President Carter. Faced with a series of foreign policy challenges, Carter was willing to admit his previous approach was not working and take steps, in his words, to make the Soviets pay for their unwanted aggression. President Obama showed no such urgency or adaptability during 8 years, whether, as we've discussed, it was the Ukraine, South China Sea, Iran, North Korea, ISIS, or a laundry list. We could add Venezuela. Instead, he would always go back to the straw man choice between the neocons' 100,000-person invasion and war, or his appeasement or failure, if he didn't appease, to do anything. Asked in August 2015 what lessons he'd learned from recent crises, President Obama said, "There's no doubt that after 6.5 years, I am that much more confident in the assessments I make and can probably see around corners faster than I did when I first came into office." That was a very different approach to a series of failures than President Carter, who admitted his naivete and took steps to restore American strength, restore the confidence of our allies, and protect American interest. I'll close with one thing because it's in the news today. It affects both the Middle East and Asia. If you like what you're seeing in North Korea today, it goes back to the 1994 Clinton Framework Agreement. That framework agreement was the precedent-setting agreement. It was actually looked at by the negotiators of the JCPOA. So if you want to see where Iran is going to be in 10 years, look at where North Korea is now. Both of those are examples of just an two unmitigated failures in 8 years of Obama foreign policy. And I leave you with that as you consider your vote. So thank you very much. And again, thanks to my distinguished co-panelist and my debate partner, who's the voice of reason, over here on the right side of the stage.
Thank you, Robert O'Brien.
Great. Well, thank you very much for putting this together, and to our colleagues on both sides. In 2.5 minutes now, I will try to summarize the world. What I want to do in taking a lot of what's happened is ask two fundamental questions I'd like you to walk away with. What is this debate about, and what is this debate not about? What this debate is not about is looking at the world and trying to decide, was any president's foreign policy perfect? Mistakes were made. I will no more blame President Obama for the invasion of Ukraine than I will blame President Bush for the invasion of Georgia in 2008. Or I will blame President Reagan for Poland declaring martial law in 1981. The question is not what happens, but how you deal with some of these things. You don't go to your doctor and blame him because you have cancer. You go to try to get some treatment. And on each of the major things that we've looked at, we either have not heard, we've heard something's a problem, or we haven't heard what a realistic solution is that would have made us better and lifted us in a better position. What this debate is about is something else. And it's about, did we have a foreign policy under President Obama that left us fundamentally stronger on the very big things that matter? And despite over an hour of this debate, we haven't heard a response for the big things that really matter that we laid out at the very beginning of this debate. And the reason why is because those are the big things that matter most to what President Obama left America in stronger shape. First, Iran was close to getting a nuclear weapon. It was 2 to 3 months away and had enough nuclear material to build 8 to 10 bombs. Iran does not have a nuclear weapon now, as international inspectors verify, and we did not have to fire a single shot to make that happen. Osama bin Laden is no longer plotting against the United States, and despite all the efforts of al-Qaeda, there have not been al-Qaeda attacks in the United States. And President Obama made that tough decision to take out Osama bin Laden when in the Situation Room, he was advised by some of his senior national security advisors not to do it. That was a bold move that other presidents would have made. We have climate change, one of the greatest long-term threats to our children and our grandchildren, that for the first time there was international coalition and action to take against it. We are fighting in the Middle East against ISIS, but we're doing it in a way that relies on special forces and intelligence and smart power that limits the risk to our treasury and our American lives. And finally, we are using our resources in a way that makes America stronger, to both put our resources in where things matter in Asia. We heard this morning from the commanding general of the U.S. Army that even the Japanese and South Koreans will say that our alliance relationship with the United States has never been stronger. And that was not the case when we were distracted before. So on balance, every foreign policy encounters difficult problems. The world is dangerous and messy. That's why you need a foreign policy. But as you look at these, when you weigh the things that mattered most versus the things we could avoid to get into, it was on the big things to keep us safe that President Obama's left us in success. And that's why Ambassador Emerson and I urge you to vote in favor of this resolution.
Thank you, Matt Spence. And finally, to conclude, speaking against the motion on the floor, Dr. Corey Shockey.
So I agree with Matt that the right standard is to say, on the biggest, most important issues, does the world feel safer at the end of the Obama administration than it did at the start of the Obama administration? And here I think Russia policy stands out in large dimensions because Russia is a much greater threat to us than Russia was 8 years ago. Moreover, all 4 of the chiefs of the military services and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have repeatedly, for the last 8 years, argued that the cuts to military spending and the Obama administration's inability to get a budget agreement with the Congress that would remove the sequestration ceilings from spending have made us less and less able to have a military counter to that threat. Another metric, it seems to me, that's useful is our adversaries, emboldened or cowed compared to where they were 8 years ago. I was a reluctant convert to the Iran agreement because I think there's a lot to dislike about it. But Matt's right. The president did take that threat off the table. What the president did not do, however, was push back on Iranian interdiction of shipping in international waters, Iranian terrorism. They're the largest state sponsor of terror in the world. Iranian destabilization of regional governments. The government of Iran took American sailors hostages in the Obama administration. That is not a government that is intimidated or feels its actions are constrained by the Obama administration's policies. So I think the standard on the one side is, are our adversaries emboldened? And I believe in the most important cases, they are Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And on the second side of the ledger, what are opportunities that might have come into view if President Obama had done his job better? And rather than give him so much credit for trade policy, I would suggest that if, for example, he had gotten the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership done more than 6 months before the end of his term and extended some effort to get Congress to pass it, President Trump's hands would have been tied and he could not have wiped that off the table. So there are opportunity costs of things not done as well.
Thank you, Corey Schock. In just a few minutes after you voted and we've tabulated the results, we're going to thank the entire panel for the fascinating discussion which they've led us through over the course of the last 90 minutes. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to open your cell phones, go back to the Pacific Council app, and cast a second ballot. But before you do, because our friend Corey Schock does have to head to the airport.
My house is in the wildfire zone, my friends.
Okay. And because we have gone a few minutes over originally scheduled time, let's take a moment and thank Corey Schock for joining us tonight and understand and wish you the best.
Really a pleasure. Yeah, a lot of fun.
So with that, we'll offer concluding remarks in just a moment and thank the panel with the breadth that they deserve. But once again, we would ask you, and we'll have a 3-minute balloting period here. 3 minutes with which to cast a vote for or against the proposition. The proposition, once again, President Obama's foreign policy was a success. Vote yes or no. We'll close the voting in 3 minutes, and a minute or two after that, we'll be able to offer you the final results, both as they stand and as they compare to the votes at the beginning of tonight's program. While you're voting, though, I think it's worth taking a minute, even before we thank our panelists, is let's thank the entire team at the Pacific Council from Jerry on down for the tremendous work that they do for us. Not just here at Members Weekend, but throughout the year. This kind of insightful, informative, and largely civil conversation, as I said earlier, is exactly what's missing in our politics and government today. And the fact that we can all take refuge in the kind of programs and conversations the Pacific Council offers is a tremendous benefit. So Jerry, you and your entire team, thank you very, very much. And I think you'd agree that as fortunate as we are as members of the Pacific Council to have the benefit of conversations like these, let's agree that as Americans and as citizens of the world, we are very, very fortunate to have brilliant leaders like Matt Spence, like John Emerson, like Corey Schock, and like Robert O'Brien to guide our elected officials through these incredibly complicated conversations to help us lead our world and our country to the safest and most secure places possible. Thank you all very, very much for all that you do. In addition to our conversation on stage, of course, about foreign policy in the Obama administration, later this evening, we will convene a panel on foreign policy in the Trump administration. That will take place in the hotel bar, and all of you are welcome to participate as panelists and questioners. Good. So how are we coming on the questions, guys? We got them? All right, give us just 1 second. We will announce the results. Just as a reminder, Matt asked everyone to vote no at the beginning. We'll see how that progresses going forward. One other update that I'll offer you: we've talked tonight about Asia and about North Korea. We've talked about Iran and Iraq and the Middle East. We've talked about Cuba and Latin America. An update, though, from Chavez Ravine. The heroic and noble Los Angeles Dodgers have just scored 2 runs in the bottom of the 5th to tie the score 2-2 against the dastardly Chicago Cubs.
And that's on in the bar, I bet. That is
Thank
on
you
in
very
the bar.
Alex, thank you. All right. So our pre-debate poll on the question, President Barack Obama's foreign policy was a success. The pre-debate poll showed a yes vote of 56% and a no vote of 44%. The post-debate poll, drum roll please, showed a yes vote of 60% and a no vote of 40%. So 4 brilliant panelists, and the result largely inconclusive. Let's thank them again for a phenomenal presentation.
You're right.